And I was in so much pain, I became open-minded. November 14, 2009 is the day I woke up. We live in a system that's really disconnecting us. We live in a system that's causing addiction.
Hello, friends. This is Pej's Recovery Corner. My name is Pej. This is a recovery podcast. We talk about all things recovery related, and that's recovering from what? Drugs, alcohol, many different things, sex addiction, and people that have a lot of mental health, if they can overcome their mental health and actually stabilize and have really good lives. We love having those types of guests on here too. Today we have a very special guest. His name is Booboo Garcia. I've actually had you on the podcast before, but it was during the pandemic, so you weren't here in person, and today you happen to be out here from Arizona. Welcome to the corner, Booboo.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me reach out to you and asking you to be on the show, because I really wanted to share some stuff that's really in my heart that I feel like I need to get out.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll get to that definitely. First of all, I see you're wearing your Broader Lens podcast t-shirt. Booboo just started a new podcast called The Broader Lens, and it's amazing. Many different types of guests that come on there. Booboo is a deep thinker. He's definitely, he loves the research. He loves to learn. He's always in learning mode. But first, let's delve into your past a little, just so people get to know who you are, because if we're going to be speaking on some stuff, we want to know what our experience is. So as far as you yourself, just maybe a brief synopsis of where you were born, where you were raised, what brought you into the path of recovery?
Well, I just left where I was born in San Pedro, California. I was raised in a home where, my parents did the best they could with the tools they had, and if they would have known better, they would have done better. And, my house, my mom was a gang member, and my father was as well. And to use drugs and alcohol, I had seen it right in front of my eyes from an early age. And, I used to say early on that my upbringing had nothing to do with my alcoholism, but I was wrong. That was something that was told to me by an old-timer. But I come to realize my upbringing has a key component that creates the perfect storm that we call addiction or alcoholism. It actually made me more prone to becoming an addict or an alcoholic as I got older. And if I really look at my upbringing, my dad would beat me. And he didn't, my parents did the best they could with the tools they had. And I truly believe that, because that's what AA taught me, and taught me how to really be aware of. If they would have known better, they would have done better. So thank you, Hector, for teaching me that. And, he taught me that early on, and I truly believe that today. I think understanding is love's other name, and I've learned that through the 12 steps. But if I look back at my past, my dad would hit me because that's what he was taught, right, by his parents or our culture, and so my dad would hit me, and I going through the 12 steps, I realized how that I got to see how that really affected me. And we'll get into that later.
Sure.
But that affected my brain development, and that fogged up my window of perception, and really created a lot of fear and that narrative in the head that we call the ego, the voice in the head. And it created an unhealthy narrative. And then it created patterns in me that affected me, and really didn't affect me early on, but affected me later in life.
Do you think when growing up in the area that you were at, was there any way to avoid any type of lifestyle that involved drug addiction, alcoholism, possible gang affiliation, things like that? Was there any way to avoid it? Like, did you have especially with your parents being people that they too were already caught up in that world? Were you more influenced by them because it was kind of a conditioned way of thinking because it was happening within the home and the neighborhood and the people that were around you? Or was there any way to duck out and say, I'm not having anything to do with that? Was their intention when raising you? Could they care less if you were drinking or using or gang banging or anything like that, or was it just a way of life and there was no way to avoid it?
I think it was a way of life, but there's always ways. Everyone perceives things differently. You hear twins in recovery, one in recovery and one not. It's just a matter of perception. And my younger sister didn't bother her, and she was able to not become an alcoholic or an addict, but that doesn't mean she got out free. She has her own, I'm sure she has her own stuff that she has to deal with.
Right. Okay, so as far as your life growing up. And I don't really today because in our last episode we talked about trauma, and what we want today's topic is more geared around, just basically authenticity. People in the program, like with the 12-step program, you were introduced to the 12-step program because you weren't doing well in your life, obviously, right? So talk a little bit about that. Like, what brought a guy like you that seemed to have been a hardened individual to the point of desperation to where you either reached out for help or somebody put their hand out to you? What brought you to that?
Well, I was in a lot of suffering. It was Carl Jung who once said, there's no coming to consciousness without pain, and I was in so much pain. I needed help. It helped me wake up. Eckhart Tolle, the spiritual teacher, once said, in the beginning of all addiction there is pain, and at the end of all addiction there is pain. And I was in so much pain. And Bill Wilson says, pain is the touch on the spiritual progress. Mm-hmm. And I was in so much pain, I became open-minded. November 14, 2009 is the day I woke up. The Buddha talked about nirvana, and I experienced a brief moment.
Wait. November
14th, 2009.
2009. I thought it said 19. I was like, okay, well, that's it's over more longer.
Yeah.
Okay.
2009, and the Buddha talked about nirvana, and nirvana basically means to blow out. And for a brief moment, that little candle, the egoic candle, that little flame was blown out. And then I was like in a state of nothingness. I was in a state of, I was no longer in the 5 sense reality. And there was no fear, there was no death, but there was no sense of self. But as quickly as that happened, and profoundly as that happened, it was like a magic candle where the candle turned back on, and I was in fear. I was full of shame and remorse, and I was in worry, and I needed help. And my friend Cedro opened the door, and he asked me a weird question: "Do you want to go to a meeting?"
Were you homeless?
I was homeless. I lost.
When we talk about homeless, were you homeless sleeping on the streets, in a tent, in a car, what?
First, I was in a car, and then I totaled the car because of a blackout. Mm-hmm. And then I was just living on the streets. And then my buddy found out I was living in the streets and let me stay in this apartment.
So the lifestyle, is it okay to talk about the past lifestyle? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the lifestyle of being from the streets, hanging in a gang, all that stuff. How does a guy go from that to being homeless? Like, nobody supported you, lifted you up, let you stay on their couch, nothing like that?
I mean, I believe I always still have my sister. My sister was always on my side. Okay. She gave me a cell phone just to know if I was still alive, pretty much,
Oh, but you didn't want to stay at her house because you wanted to go out.
I didn't want to bother her, and but I burned a lot of bridges. Everything that gave me a sense of self was stripped away from my alcoholism.
Mm-hmm. All right, so then let's talk about that too. So then that guy opened the door for you to take you to a meeting. Mm-hmm. You went to the meeting and you heard right away a message of hope, or what did you?
No, right away, the first meeting, I heard Charlie Brown's Teacher. You heard that over and over. Wah. That's all I heard in the meeting, because I was in a lot of fear and scared and
What was that meeting? Long Beach?
It was in Torrance. And it was it's no longer there, but it was a big meeting. It was about couple hundred people for sure. And but I did feel one thing that happened to me during the meeting is everyone said a prayer at the end, and for the first time I felt safe in a very long time. So
then, did you continue going to meetings?
Yeah, we went to a bunch of meetings. I had my friend Cedro take me to all kinds of meetings. They say 90 meetings in 90 days, and
but you know how that originated, right?
No,
90 meetings in 90 days was a judge that appointed someone to go to 90 meetings for 90 days in hopes of them gaining some kind of recovery or message to keep them out of trouble from all the DUIs.
Yeah, you're right.
That's where it originated. Okay, so you were going to meetings regularly, but where were you living at the time?
I was living with my friend who brought me to Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay, so then while living with your friend, within that time of going to meetings, did some kind of light come on for you?
Yeah, I got a hope. I seen my friend Javier, the third meeting I went to, and he's from the streets, from Pedro, and he was known to, you didn't want to look at him wrong or mess with him because he was known to use his gun, he was just a fool on the streets, well respected for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And I seen him laughing and giggling, eating cookies, and the light was glowing in him, like before Bill Wilson. Mm-hmm. And I got hope.
Okay, so then was he taking you to meetings afterwards, Javier, or just that one guy?
They
kind of just brought you.
Yeah, they just brought me in and
surrounded you.
found an active group in Rancho Palos Verdes, and they had a lot of commitments, and they were active members of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay.
And I always say one of the greatest agents for change is an example, and they were the perfect example for me.
How so?
Because they taught me how to wax on, wax off like the Karate Kid. And what I mean by that is I don't know why they're getting all these commitments, coming to the meetings early, leaving late. And I do know that I needed all that as a newcomer.
They were demonstrating what AAs do in order to keep the meeting intact and the program and the fellowship powerful and good and welcoming, correct?
Yeah, and I felt like they were talking to me without judgment, the meeting before the meeting, the meeting during the meeting after the meeting, and I started to develop a fellowship.
But during that time, was there ever some old-timers or even some people that did talk in a judgmental form or way, or did you not hear that?
I couldn't hear that at the time. But
there were some people that talked that way, but
sure.
Was your mind thinking, well, this is kind of just the way it runs, and you're going to have that guy, and you're going to have this guy, and you're going to have this guy, or what?
I didn't see any of that at the very beginning. So, I just felt people, I felt like, can I cuss on here?
Of course you can.
I felt like flies on shit. And I'm the piece of shit because that's the mindset I had walking into AA, and everyone was the flies rushing me. And they were welcoming me with open arms.
So they were coming and showing you love, that AA love. And there's a lot of AA love. Mm-hmm. Depending on the groups you go to. There's a lot of groups that the newcomer is the most important person to them. They want to make that person feel welcome. Sometimes it's overwhelming because you see all this love. You're not used to that, especially when you're a non-trustworthy person that comes in here where everybody else has shunned you or turned their backs on you. Now all of a sudden you come into a 12-step program. And everyone's like, hey, come over here. You're my friend. I want to be your friend. Here's my phone number. Here's some coffee. Come over here. Have a seat. All that stuff. So that's what was happening for you.
Yeah, that's what was happening for me.
And were you illiterate when you got sober?
Yeah, I didn't know how to read. They would ask me.
Why didn't you know how to read?
Because I just never really paid attention in school.
So in your childhood, growing up in school and stuff like that, it wasn't interesting for you?
No, and I think the part of that was with, just my parents they weren't really having me be disciplined when it came to school.
Yeah.
My parents were doing their own thing, and I'm not saying they were bad parents. They were just caught up within themselves as well in the system we live in. So it was boring to me to go to school. The only time I went was to ditch, find friends, and socialize, and
so you knew basic words and stuff like that, but you weren't a well-read person.
Yeah, not at all. No, I had a hard time reading the book, especially the way it was written.
So, the big book?
Mm-hmm.
So did you learn to read in the big book?
I learned how to read. I learned how to use a dictionary. I learned how to memorize some of the readings because it was really scary for me when I was asked to read, and I'm stuttering and I don't know words, and it was hard.
So the person that you asked to be your spiritual advisor, or some people call them sponsors, was that person aware that you didn't know how to read? Would they sit with you and read with you?
I went through a number of sponsors, but I had people that really took the time with me and showed me what things meant, how to use the correct words instead of using whatever, and really help broaden that awareness in me.
So your interest broadened because you were reading, like, as far as through the program. Here's the thing: I met you when you were 4 years sober. Okay, I saw you somewhere and you were talking, and you were giving a talk that was very, very 12-step based, right? With your own personal life intertwined within the story. So I thought, okay, this guy right here is in the book. To think that you were illiterate and then speaking like that within a few years, obviously something was, and I like the fact that they were helping you, like, be there for you and show you the way. So tell me more about that. Like, what is it during the time, like when you were sober in the first few years, was AA your only common interest, or did you start researching other literature of teachings or spirituality or things like that?
I would say it was my first year. It was all AA. I went to every meeting every day, and sometimes 2 meetings a day. I mean, I was homeless. I had no job. I lost my family. Everything that gave me that sense of self was stripped away, and I wanted to change more than anything in life.
So then, afterwards, like, I know you started getting when you and I became friends during that time, I was already very deep into reading about Rumi and Wayne Dyer and Deepak Chopra and Marianne Williamson. We're both fans of Marianne Williamson. So once you learn how to start reading and learning dictionaries of words and all that stuff, what made you want to think outside the box instead of just be going to meetings and hearing the AA terminology?
It's not that I think I had an experience where I had a lot of mysticism come to me. I felt like I was pointed certain directions to study stuff, and sometimes I had stuff come to me. So I learned early on about the Gnostic Gospels. I learned early on, I started searching religion, and I know a lot of pastors don't know what they're preaching. They're just conditioned to preach a certain way, and I'm not afraid to say that. I started learning
it's okay
about...
to say that. You know why?
Why?
Because it's true.
Yeah.
Because it is true. Like a lot of people, that is a little too deep for some people to comprehend. But based off of some of the teachings of my spiritual advisors, they've told me most Christians, most Muslims even, majority don't really know what Islam is. Most Christians don't really know the history behind Christianity or whatever. They just, based off of what they've been taught from a book by a person, think that is the way. And not to discount anybody from any religion. Everybody to each their own. Everyone can believe what they want. But it fascinates me how some people will just stick to one book and one religion and think that is the only way, which discounts anything that anybody else on earth believes. So then you said you started having these, we'll say, mystical, like mysticism type of thoughts. Like your deeper inner self obviously seems to be appearing and showing itself.
Yeah, it did, and I started looking at all religions, and Bill Wilson was clear. He didn't make any of this up. It came from ancient sources, and every religion and the beauty of every religion is they share the same universal spiritual principles, and it all comes down to love. It's the belief systems that develop within the human institutions that create the division, ignorance, and disunity with humanity.
Why did you study? I mean, I have my own reasons for why I became very interested in the 12-step world. I'm an analyst. I like to overanalyze everything and see why does this program that's saved millions of people, why does it work, right? So I remember sitting in my counselor's office, Mr. Sia. There was a picture of two guys on the wall. I'm like, who's the two white guys on the wall? He said, well, those are the founders of AA. That's Bill and Bob. I'm like, why do you like them? Why do you have them framed on your wall? He goes, because they saved our lives. I'm like, what do you mean they saved our lives? And so he went on to talk about, Alcoholics Anonymous, you should be reading this book. He got me into the big book. And then I told him I'm not an alcoholic, at least I don't think I am, but I needed to definitely diagnose myself rather than have anyone pronounce me as an alcoholic. But then I got into the NA book, and then I went and researched why NA was even created, because a lot of them felt like when they were in AA, this is around the 50s, they were shunned by Alcoholics Anonymous, that would come members that would say, singleness of purpose, don't talk about drugs in here, although the big book has a lot of drug talk in it, sedatives, intravenously shooting morphine, things like that. So you became a studier of Bill and Bob. I know that. No matter what your reason was for moving to Ohio, but however many years ago that was, what ended up happening out of that, you started going to Dr. Bob's house. You even renovated, helped them do a lot of stuff because you're a carpenter. So, as a person that was already a history buff, why did you want to study them so much? I
don't know. I was blessed with a lot of old timers that, like on the hill, and then hearing Johnny, and in Rancho Palos Verdes, Pat. A lot of old timers really gave me the history, and I'm grateful for that. So I learned the history whether I wanted to or not. Mm-hmm. For some reason, they were teaching me the history. And, I know Pat on the hill in Rancho Palos Verdes, he took one time 3 hours and shared each character, the name, place, almost time, and wrote down the whole story. And he was crying as he was doing that because it touched him. Right. And I'm grateful for that.
So, in studying these two figures that came together, and you and I, for a guy like me that was questioning my counselor, why do you have those two guys on the wall? And years later, I become friends with you, and then we actually go in Ohio. We went to the Mayflower Hotel where Bill was going to drink or make the phone call where he then talked to Dr. Bob. We went and sat together in the house that Henrietta Sieberling actually provided the space for one alcoholic to talk to another to try to help each other from drinking. What was it supposed to be, a 15-minute talk that turned into like a few hours, right?
Yeah.
And so we've done our research. So we've gone to Sister Ignatia's, the hospital where, what was it called, Towns Hospital? To the actual hospital where she was giving the medallions to the people in the alcoholic ward. So you showed me parts of AA history come to life much more than me just watching My Name is Bill W., which is a great movie.
Yeah.
There's a great movie. James Wood and James Garner portraying the founders of AA in a major motion picture. But in being there during that time, did your ideas about AA change?
Yeah, because we develop an image of who Bill and Bob were without really researching. So of course it changed because I learned more about them, and I realized, like, if anyone wants to check out the Akron pamphlets, and Dr. Bob didn't write anything, but he had his buddy write it, but it came off the mind of Dr. Bob. They're called the Akron pamphlets. And in the Akron pamphlets, he breaks down the world religions, and he basically showing that it's all the same principles. He even says, and this may sound like a blasphemous
Dr. Bob.
Yeah, Dr. Bob. It may sound like a blasphemous to some people, but Dr. Bob says we can easily replace the 12 steps with the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, and there wouldn't be a difference.
He said that.
He said that, and it's not that he's saying Buddhism's correct. What he's saying is it's all universal principles.
Mm-hmm.
And if you really, a lot of people would say, yeah, it came from the Bible, it came from this, it came from that, but they're all universal. It came from everywhere. It's the universal principles, and no one owns them. Mm-hmm. And if you really look at Buddhism, the four noble truths, 4 plus the eightfold path equals 12, right?
It's your 12 steps.
Yeah.
Okay, so then when Bill and Bob were trying, based off of your research and studies and everything you've read and everything you've been told, during that time when they were putting together the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, were they trying to not come from a Christian standpoint? Because obviously it started from the Oxford group. There were 6 steps. Eddie was he was basically 12-step or 6-stepped by that group because they went to court for him. They helped him stay out of the asylum. And then Eddie came and talked to Bill, which they were drinking buddies, as far as what we know, right? Because the way the stories in the big book might not be completely accurate to the way it was written. There's also that other book that says how the big book was written and stuff like that. So, but during that time, and we saw something else that you showed me in the house. In Dr. Bob's bedroom upstairs, there was a bunch of magazines and books laid out on the ground, right? And they were studying these books and magazines to try to have a broader, open mind towards many different types of people that are probably alcoholics that will end up hopefully needing a program to help them stay sober. Like, what is the varieties of religious experiences that's written by William James, right? All this stuff. So there's something that you often talk to me about that a lot of people don't know. I think it involves Ouija boards and spook parties and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? Who was involved and why they were involved?
Well, I don't know every single person that was involved, but I know Dr. Bob and Bill and their wives are involved.
That's the founders.
Yeah, right?
Okay.
Of Al-Anon and Alcoholics.
Exactly.
But they called themselves a spook group. In Bill's Stepping Stones, there's a room called a spook room, they called it.
So for those that don't know what Stepping Stones is, what is it?
Where Bill lived.
In New York?
In New York. I don't know the exact city, but it's...
But you've been there?
Outskirts of New York. Yeah, I've been there.
So you've gone there.
Been more in Dr. Bob's house. But,
yeah.
And I've had historians from Akron tell me about Bob and how open-minded he was. He was really an open-minded individual. I even had a historian, and she's a huge part of the Dr. Bob movement, say that, he's getting into the chakras. They were just very open-minded, and they were seekers.
And Ouija boards?
They're Ouija boards. Bill considered himself to be a psychic medium, and he actually, if you read Pass It On, chapter 16,
yeah,
he talks about that stuff.
Pass It On is official AA literature. It's written by...
But, Bill Wilson talks about being... in chapter 16 about using the Ouija board, talks about the spook group, and he talks about trying to help transition other
spiritualism,
discarnates, is that how you say it? Discarnates beings to the other side. And Bill talks about getting proof that they were actually real people. So that was Bill Wilson. He was like a mystic. I think Bill was more of a seer, which they called mystics. Like Thomas Merton was a seer, and he could see things at a more broader level.
Do you think a lot of old timers that are AA members that have very dogmatic, do it by the book and do it by the traditions type of mentality, and do you think they read any of that stuff?
I think a lot of people, I mean, most people don't like to read, or it's not that they don't like to read. We live in a system that got us super busy. I mean, it's hard to get people to text back, like with family members and stuff. Like I text family members, they don't even text me back until the next day. So we live in a system that's really disconnecting us. We live in a system that's causing addiction. And we live in a system that's got everyone super busy in the rat race, especially here in California.
Okay. Bill praised during the time Dr. William D. Silkworth. Enough to where, and I know you often say this, a lot of people in Alcoholics Anonymous say, don't tell us about your opinion, just keep it to the program. So there's a doctor's opinion right in the beginning of the big book, and it's not an alcoholic. Now, besides the fact that he praises it, there's also other parts in the big book where it talks about people's opinions. Like, it's okay. Like, we want to hear your opinion. Yet people in AA will go and profess and say, we don't want to hear your opinion. Stick to the steps or stick to the program, which is great. Like, yeah, the steps are definitely going to help lots of people. It's been known, and it's not even a full century old, the program as a whole. But as far as Bill asking Dr. William Silkworth, not just one letter, it was 2 letters to contribute to the book. What came out of that, and this is what I've listened, because I listen a lot, and we've talked about this a lot too, is a lot of people say this is a threefold disease, right? They talk about an obsession of the mind, an allergy of the body, and a spiritual malady, right? Now, even Dr. Silkworth, they base the allergy analogy as a theory. It's not an actual allergy where somebody drinks alcohol and breaks out in hives, if you will, right? But then we understand what the meaning is behind why he's saying it. But for a doctor to, and I want you to expand on this because we talked about it earlier, for a doctor to create an analogy, call it something, and a movement respects the doctor, but then when they go out and profess and talk about their alcoholism, just because this guy was theorizing, they then incorporate that into who they believe they are. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, it's a metaphor. It's important to understand it's a metaphor. There's no such thing as an allergy of the body. And that may seem crazy for people to hear that are really stuck with that belief, but there's no such thing. And if you look it up, it always takes you back to Alcoholics Anonymous. There's no modern research that talks about an allergy of the body. Now, we know more about the pleasure centers in the brain, like dopamine and stuff, where, that gives us, some kind of like, what it does for us is the pleasure chemical, right? But the more we chronically use that, we desensitize the receptors where we're always going to need more. But the driving force of that is really some kind of trauma. And the big book says selfishness, self-centeredness, we think is the root of our troubles, but I disagree. I call it trauma. But even that word, as we talked, me and Daniel Mate talked,
which is Gabor Mate's son.
Gabor Mate's son. About Gabor Mate's son, we talked about, the trauma piece. I think it's the engine for all addiction. And if you really look into Bill Wilson's life, he suffered from what Dr. Gabor calls the big T traumas, the adverse childhood experience. And it's really hard to get Dr. Bob's childhood details. There's not as much, but I need to look more into it, so that may change as well. But he had the little T traumas, and I like what Daniel and Gabor, they break down the big T and the small T traumas, and big T is the events that shouldn't have happened, and the little T's are the good things that didn't happen. And if you really look at the word resentment, which comes from the Latin word sentita, it means to refill. It means to fill, and re means again. And what are we refilling? These displeasurable, traumatic, or hurtful events, because all trauma really means in Greek is wound. And the book's pretty clear where we were hurt or threatened. And going back to the addiction part, people are ignorant when they are so egoic when it comes to someone saying I'm an addict in Alcoholics Anonymous, because in truth, whoever created the term dope addict is right, because we're all dopamine addicts and that's what we're seeking. Why do you think the jaywalker's doing these crazy behaviors? Because he needs some dopamine release to get out of self. And that's the whole purpose. And one thing I talk about with allergy of the body, well, there's no such thing as allergy of the body, but I give people the analogy like this, living in Arizona. If you're here and you're in 70-degree weather, degree AC, and you're watching a football game or whatever you're watching, and you take a drink of the water, and you just put it down, you continue to watch the game, and there's nothing, right? You got a little, you put it down, you just continue to watch the game.
Yeah.
But if I'm in Arizona in 115-degree weather hiking, I'm going to have a different effect on the water than you did. The effect is more heightened because I have this emotional and psychological baggage that's wounded, these wounds inside of me, and that's going to give me some kind of relief. So one thing I like about Gabor Mate, and I challenge Alcoholics Anonymous to continue to look at modern science and what they have to say, because in reality, there's only a 5 to 8% success rate in AA and in recovery as a whole.
How many percent?
5 to 8%. That's what most scholars would say.
And it's interesting that in the big book, if you read in the forewords and the preface, right?
Yeah.
It's talking about the success rate during that time, what had happened between editions, right? I think it says 50% at first and then another 75%. But obviously we're in a different time. There's a lot more people. There's a lot more people living on Earth. There's a lot more people that come to AA. So lower statistics are to be expected, or is somebody scaring people away from AA?
Yeah, I don't know. But like one of the co-founders, his name's Henry Parkhurst. It wasn't just Dr. Bob. Dr. Bob really didn't have much to do with the big book, nor did Akron. And you could talk to Bill Shaberg about that. I talked to him, and he's cool people, and he wrote right in the big book, spent a lot of research time. And Jay Stennett, I love Jay. He's a historian.
He was on your podcast?
Yeah. But anyways, Henry Parkhurst, we don't know, but he was a co-founder. If it wasn't for Henry Parkhurst, we might not have a big book. Because he really pushed Bill to do it. And he wrote The Employers, but he relapsed or drank again 6 months in 6 months in after the big book was written. Mm-hmm. So he got kind of pushed away from history a little bit for a while, But he was a co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous.
Even Eddie drank.
Yeah, he was another co-founder. There were many co-founders, not just Bill and Bob.
Too, right?
I consider him a co-founder. Yeah.
Was Hank?
He carried the message, even though there's 3 versions of the Bill Wilson meeting at each story. Or there's 3 versions of, actually, let me correct that. There's 3 versions of Bill's story.
3 versions?
Yeah.
Oh, that were before it was actually put into the book.
Yeah.
3
the
versions.
third one is what we get in the big book, but there's 2 more.
Were they expanded, or was it different stories?
Well, the first one, Bill didn't get to the solution, and the second one, what I like about the second one, there's like one line in the very beginning, and he talks about how his parents separated. But knowing his story, his childhood story, like I could feel the hurt in his words, and I wish he would have kept that.
So you've researched that, and you've seen the different versions.
Yeah, I've seen. Bill Shaberg has a really beautiful book that the research work, and he tells you where to look, but. It's pretty obvious. Bill Shaberg did a lot of research on that stuff. And
so wait. So if in the first version of Bill's story that wasn't released, parents got separated, do you see that as trauma?
Oh yeah, he had abandonment issues, dual abandonment issues with his parents leaving, and Bill he almost died in his at birth, and his mother. Mm-hmm. So that's trauma. Bill talks about him being emotionally branded when his mother hit him for the first time. He never let go of that. That was traumatizing, because the people that we're supposed to love and feel safe with in the world are the people, when you hit a child, that causes some trauma to kids. For some kids, not all kids. I can't speak for everybody. It did for me. And I don't know how to process that stuff correctly,
Sometimes, I understand that too, but I've had a world of trauma that I always thought definitely brought me more to a drink or a drug to try to numb out and not have to feel. That was always my belief system, and it wasn't just off of what was being taught to me in treatment. It was what I was feeling within my core, right? Now, let's take it back to, there's a lot of members of Alcoholics Anonymous, or some members of Alcoholics Anonymous that, and sometimes they're old timers, and sometimes they're people that are, just a few years in that were either taught by the old timers or they have their own belief system. But when you bring up the word trauma,
it scares people, and as Daniel said, it's very heavy. But
they don't want to correlate it with alcoholism.
No. But it's more closer to the truth than to say selfish and self-centeredness is the root of our troubles. And it's important to understand that Bill didn't know everything. And he says, we realize we know only a little. God will constantly disclose more to you and to us. Mm-hmm. And it's important for us to stay willing, honest, and open-minded with ourselves, not just as newcomers, but as the old-timers as well. And I will point to the old-timers because there's stuff that needs to be changed. And working at Dr. Bob's house going back, you see the 2x4s are beautiful, structured. There are actually better 2x4s in Dr. Bob's house than there are in what we can buy at Home Depot. Why? Because it was built in a different time. But there's a lot of stuff that needs to be remodeled. If you go to Dr. Bob's house, the rooms are smaller. The hallways are more narrow. The countertops you might not want in today's world. You might want to change the electricity, the electrical stuff, the plumbing. It needed to be updated, and we need to be updated as a fellowship. And I'm not afraid to say that because there's only a 5 to 8% success rate. And if I was the Lakers coach with a 5% success rate, I probably wouldn't have a job. And what do I mean by that? Because every 3 weeks there's a 9/11 in addiction, which means people are dying from alcoholism and drug addiction. And alcoholism is an addiction. That word shouldn't be a bad word in AA. And the book's pretty clear. Alcohol became my master. And if you look at the word addictus in Latin, it goes back to something of being a slave. And we were a slave to alcoholism. We're a slave to heroin. We're a slave to behaviors, which we find in 6 and 7. And so alcohol has become my master, and behavior patterns.
So a couple of questions which might be a little controversial, but I don't think you're afraid to answer. Do you think the doctor's opinion is outdated and could be updated with modern day science and doctors' interpretation of what alcoholism is?
It's definitely outdated, and I think AA needs to start looking at modern science. And if you look at Bill's letters, he always talked about being updated with modern science and be open-minded to new discoveries.
Not be frozen.
And the words he used in that is frozen dogmatic set of beliefs.
Bill said that.
Bill
Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, said, don't be frozen in dogmatic beliefs.
Yeah, and it's either in Language of the Heart or AA Comes of Age. I can't think right now, but as far as which book it's in, but it's in there.
Okay, so, and it would be nice to have a guy like Gabor Mate come in, which I don't think the way AA functions and runs, they're not going to be open to a guy that doesn't even say that addiction is a disease. But then again, the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't say it's a disease. That became something that was more commonly used due to the medical and insurance board of professionals that had to come together to call it something other than an alcoholic illness.
Yeah, it's not a disease, and Bill had a problem with that, and he never used it in the book.
The only place in the big book where the word
Page
disease
64.
was, and that's
a spiritual
resentment is number one offender.
It creates all types of spiritual disease.
From it formed all
resentment.
Yeah.
But we shouldn't even take the words of Bill literally, like a full-on truth, like it's become gospel today.
A lot of people praise Bill. They think, this is our founder. We need to talk like him. We need to think like him. We need to share like him. We need to share about him all the time, right? Like people, nobody really knows what was going on there. If you really, really research Bill, he was an egotistical person too, just like any other man could be, right? He was performing adultery on his wife. He was definitely finding other ways of spirituality. And there's a lot of people that'll try to throw a wrench in AA's belief system by saying the founder was even doing LSD. Mm-hmm. What was he doing LSD for?
Bill was always finding new ways to help the alcoholic. And Bill went through a lot of depression. He realized, at one point, holy shit, maybe the steps don't have all the answers.
So I think for a long time he thought they did have all the answers?
I can't answer that, but I know
the depression can't come from nothing. It's coming from trauma.
It comes from trauma, and just like Marty Manns, our first lady in AA, she wasn't the first lady, but that's what they call it. Mm-hmm. She had a lot of depression.
So they were kind of calling her like the first lady because of like a presidential figure.
Yeah, I don't know, to be honest.
Like a leader. Okay, so she had a lot of trauma.
But okay, I think one thing I want to talk about is going back to the dogma, because the same beautiful fellowship that promised me to have an awakening is the same fellowship that I feel is kind of crucifying me for having my own awakening. And Ralph Waldo Emerson said something very beautiful. And I'm going to paraphrase his words, but he says, every great institution is a lengthened shadow of a great man. And when you have an awakening, I'm not going to be in someone's shadow. That was the whole problem in the very beginning with my alcoholism.
Yeah.
Looking at my past and the persona that I developed. And I'm not going to be in Bill Wilson's shadow. I'm not going to be stuck in Bill's words and take them. I'm going to think for myself. And on the chips we passed, it says, to thy own self be true. It's a beautiful saying, but who actually knows how to live that?
Right.
The most beautiful thing I have experienced in having an awakening is authenticity, which I believe is the real minority in today's world, including in Alcoholics Anonymous and other fellowships as well.
Do you think the people in Alcoholics Anonymous that get hung up on the word trauma and don't want you to use it or correlate it to alcoholism might have a lot of trauma themselves? Why do they get so upset?
Well, you could hear it in speakers all the time. I felt disconnected. I felt different. I never felt a part of. That's trauma. That's the effects of trauma, because as Dr. Peter Levine says, trauma is the loss of self. Recovery is to get back. Here's one thing I want to say about Gabor Mate. Gabor Mate says something beautiful. And he says, is alcohol addictive? Yes or no? Is heroin addictive? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Is sex addictive? Yes or no? And he continues to go down the line, right? And he says, and the answer is embedded in the question, depending on the amount of pain we need to soothe. So when we drink, Bill talks about the alcoholic miracle.
Mm-hmm.
I call it the alcohol miracle, because he talks about his first time getting drunk. And it's his second time drinking, and he drank Bronx cocktails. And he had the same effect that what alcohol did for him did for me as well. Carl Jung called it spiritus contra spiritum. But what it did was, he talks about the barrier between man and woman and him were gone. And he had this effect where he have arrived, right? And that's what happened to me. Like, I no longer worried about my parents, who my parents were, my neighbor, all this, it gave me a shift in perception. Mm-hmm. And I was no longer in that conscious separation that Chuck C talked about. I'm in conscious unity. And that's the effects what alcohol did for me.
Do you think the singleness of purpose in Alcoholics Anonymous is outdated?
If you look at it, to one point it is, because when it's become really egotistical of someone saying, when label consciousness is part of the ego, right? Mm-hmm. And if they don't fit the right label, they don't belong here. Instead of really taking the time and have understanding and educating people and showing them, they may have been an alcoholic, but there's many people in Alcoholics Anonymous, let's get honest here, that are just addicts, but they feel more comfortable in AA because of the spiritual program.
It's true.
And
there's some people in Alcoholics Anonymous that claim to be alcoholics that never really drank. They did drugs. They ended up in AA, so they thought they needed to conform to the AA way by practicing or following AA etiquette and identifying correctly in the right meeting and not calling themselves an addict, but they never even really were an alcoholic. Now, there's some people that also say, well, I didn't drink, but I have alcoholism. Like I have the ism, I have alcoholism. The cool thing that I've seen, and I'm sober 16 plus years, and I tell you this all the time, I'm like, we're right there, shoulder to shoulder, is the 12-step meetings or organization like Cocaine Anonymous, Heroin Anonymous. Cocaine Anonymous and Heroin Anonymous go straight out of the big book. We've got Narcotics Anonymous that created their own book, their own steps. I mean, it's all based off the fundamental ideas of AA. It's much simpler. It's a simpler read, and it's much, even the steps, the way they're broken down are simpler to actually, there's a lot of questions that come with it. But if you really dissect the NA workbook, for example, the way it's written, a lot of it, you could tell, comes straight out of the big book. It was just in a more simpler fashion. But when we talk about inclusivity and exclusivity. When you go to CA, you can identify as anything you want to. You can say, I'm an alcoholic, I never did cocaine, but you still share your story, and they're highly accepting of you. They don't care. They don't care. Truly, they're all about building the fellowship, speaking freely, carrying the message, carrying the solution, and not finger pointing and saying you're doing it wrong, you're doing it this way, you're doing it that way. So I know that you yourself, over the years, we talk, and sometimes I think some things that happen to you have happened to me, but you personalize it a little bit more, and I tend to wonder. It makes me sad because I know that you and I both were raised in a certain 12-step community, and sometimes and I've seen this many times. I've seen a lot of people outgrow the fellowship, but I often say Alcoholics Anonymous is not the fellowship. That's just one part of the triangle. There's so much more to it. Those principles that come from the steps and all that was always what was important to me. But what happened to you, even more recently, if you don't mind me asking, that made you really, really feel a certain way because people expected something of you you didn't agree with?
Well, let's just say it's hard for me to be me in Alcoholics Anonymous or any 12-step. And I love that about CA because they're more inclusive.
Yeah.
And it probably helps prevent, they probably have less dogma. I'm not in CA, but I'm sure there's probably less dogma.
I've never experienced any dogma.
Yeah, it's because of the inclusiveness, and it's a beautiful thing. Label consciousness separates people.
Right.
I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican.
Mm-hmm.
That's label consciousness. I'm an alcoholic, I'm an addict.
Well, you've been challenged by some people in Alcoholics Anonymous to come and stick to a certain tradition. Can you...
Yeah.
When someone says something like that to you, if you're going to speak at our meeting, we would like for you to stick to, let's say, Tradition 5.
Tradition 5, it's, it's about carrying the message, right? And I think the message should always come from the heart, not in some book. The book may have some great messages, but it should always be authentic from the heart. And me, I share my own. I don't I parrot some things like everyone, and I don't parrot a lot of things. And I just to thy own self be true, right? And express the way I feel that needs to come out of my heart. Mm-hmm. Pray only for the knowledge of God's will and the power to carry it out. You can't find that in a book.
Right.
It comes from the heart of intuition. That's the most powerful thing in step 11, which is the steps are like egos, and it takes one step to connect to the other in order to carry the message. So no one could really organize that or tell you how that should look.
Right.
If they're doing that, it becomes a lie. Like Wayne Dyer said, the truth is the truth until you organize it, and then it becomes a lie. So
sometimes people challenge you as far as they want you to follow certain traditions, but have you not yourself studied the traditions extensively? What is the point of the traditions? What are they?
I shared at a conference in Arizona. I told you about this before.
Yeah.
And I forgot, it was something about Tradition 4. I forgot which line they used, but I said Tradition 4, no need for AA cops. Because cops. And I call it Tradition 4 the spiritual step, because it allows us to be autonomous and be whoever we want to be, but be mindful not to hurt AA as a whole. And we may be breaking the traditions right now, some people may say, but I feel like this, the more we don't talk about things, the more we become sick as individuals and at a collective level. And if everything's an outside issue, and we're not talking about it, then we can be, they call us an untreated alcoholic if we're not applying the principles and really, staying honest and willing and open-minded. Well, same thing with the collective. You can also become sick as a collective as well, and I think it's important to talk about this stuff and how we're going to talk about it if no one wants to talk about it, and we always have room for improvement, but thinking differently in Alcoholics Anonymous is hard, man, because you get crucified, for being authentic and being more creative, and that's what the beauty of the steps provide. For an example, I'll go to a meeting and it'll be on a reading that self-knowledge avails us nothing. And then I might say, do you really believe these guys that they're using as examples or have self-knowledge, or is it just information? Because self-knowledge got me sober. The word Gnostic, you look at agnostic, remove the word a, and it means to know. It means knowledge. Gnosis, right? That's the Greek meaning. And I got that knowledge through doing the 12 steps and with the old timers and the people teaching me gratitude, have gratitude, and all that stuff. That all developed into self-knowledge. I learned the nature of my suffering, and I learned how to be more mindful, more aware. And I always love the word ignorance because it's an extension of the word ignore. And if I ignore my daily life, I become sick spiritually. But AA has taught me to be more mindful, more aware. And that's all self-knowledge. And it's more aware. Awareness is like the sun. When it truly shines forth on things, it becomes transformed. I've learned all that shit through the beauty of the 12 steps, some of the great old timers, the meetings. There's a lot of beauty in AA.
So when you get irritated because somebody in the fellowship says something to you based off of how they want their meeting to run and how they want you to talk in their meeting, it's not that you're mad at AA. You still have the love and respect for AA as a whole, as the steps, as the people that were always loving and accepting. Because my experience with a lot of meetings I went to early on, I wanted to try different flavors. I wanted to see different varieties of different versions of different meetings. I went to the meeting with the crusty old timers that some of them talked to you a certain way, some of them would scold you in their share after you shared, especially if you identified as an addict and an alcoholic. So I was learning right away, don't say that, don't do this, right? Because if you say that in that meeting, Harry's going to put his hand up and he's going to say some shit to you afterwards to come at you, not directly, but to say, we do it like this around here, you're doing it wrong, right? But then there was, a few times that I shared it, there was always one or two people that would come and bring the warmth. They would put their arm around me and say, just so you know, you're welcome here. And those are the ones that I feel were demonstrating the truth of how we really should be in AA. These days, there's fentanyl anonymous meetings that have started, right? And there's a lot of fentanyl addicts, there's a lot of drug addicts, there's a lot of substance abuse addicts that end up coming to AA because the druggy buggy will bring them, the no boozer cruiser will bring them, the treatment centers will bring them, right? So they're bussed in and shipped into AA, but then AA comes and says, well, they don't put any money in the basket. Or they can go get their energy drinks and they can get their cigarette or their vapes and things like that, but they're not even contributing. But dude, if they're coming to your meetings, show them how you are really, truly practicing these principles in all of your affairs rather than judging them and shunning them. Because potentially some of them really could get a lot out of this without being labeled just an alcoholic.
That's what I mean, is stop being so dogmatic, man. It's have more, be, a little bit more loving and more kind. One thing I hate, one of the reasons I hate is how it works. Yeah. Because we're blaming the newcomer. Maybe, he's not ready yet. He's not honest. Well, maybe he's stuck in trauma. And maybe he can pass the lie detector test.
Wasn't how it works, along with the big book, written within Bill's first 3 years of sobriety?
About 3 years, almost 4 years.
Based off of what he had experienced with people that were not wanting to see this way of life or people that eventually were starting to see this way of life.
Well, it's important to understand that he made up a lot of stuff. Bill, a lot of the stuff written in Bill's story, if you look at Ebby Thatcher, those ain't actual factual events that happened. And Bill Shaber did a lot of research.
How do you know?
Look at Bill Shaber's book. I encourage anyone to read that book because even Ernest Kurtz, his wife, wrote a beautiful introduction. I forget. She wrote something beautiful about him and his work because he did a lot of research, and I love Bill Shaber. I think he's a hero, for being courageous and really showing and taking the time to help us expand.
Is he like an AA historian?
He's a historian, yes, for sure. And one thing he does show is Ebby has a version of Bill's story, how they met. And Ebby was sober, Bill was drunk. And Ebby's story is kind of boring. It had no message.
Yeah.
But Bill's, even though it wasn't factual, it had a message with depth and weight. So I respect what Bill did. He created a message, even though it wasn't facts. It was more attractive for me and you when we read it. But it's also important to know that just because something worked for me may not work for the next person. Yeah. And I gotta pray only for the knowledge of God's will and the power to carry that out. Mm-hmm. Not everything's gonna work. You hear people all the time say, I only know how to sponsor what was taught. Well, that tells me they're not utilizing step 11 properly. Because we pray only for the knowledge of God's will and the power to carry it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So let's talk about the Broader Lens podcast. I know that you had some interest in starting a podcast. A lot of people have a lot of interest in starting a podcast, but because you're a person that's a deep thinker and thinks outside the box with a lot of things, you're not just conformed to one way of spirituality. Sobriety is something that I think we've talked about this too. That whole all we have is a daily reprieve, right? Really, like, you're on board with staying sober. It's not about like a daily reprieve, like I'll drink if I don't do this, like today, right? And that's, again, more terminology that comes from the big book. But you're writing a book currently?
Yeah. I'm writing a book called Awakening Within. And
you went to school, you've been going to school?
I started going to school, but I got into it with a couple of professors. Well, I didn't get into it with them. They got into it with me. They kind of told me off. And I just realized, like, I'm wasting my time because and maybe if
what were you studying?
Anthropology, but I don't know. Right now, I'm just too busy writing a book, so I paused the school thing right now. And
you've met some heroic people over the years that are historians, anthropologists, things like that, and gone on journeys to Egypt and things like that. So, on your broader lens, podcast, what is that podcast about? Why do you have it? What's it all about?
It's about really challenging our beliefs and our perception for the greater good, I like to say. And it's going to be a little thought-provoking for people, but it's about us questioning ourselves, and Tupac said something beautiful. And he says, let's change the way we live, let's change the way we eat, let's change the way we treat each other. The old way wasn't working, but it's up to us to do what we got to do to survive. And it's hard to look outside now. I just came back from my own hometown, San Pedro, and there's so much homeless. There's so much people in poverty, and like anybody that has an awakening, it's hard to not look at that and not feel that, because if you're in tune to the oneness of life, you can feel that, and it hurts my heart. So that's an awakening, in tune with the oneness of life. In Christianity, they talk about God's children and we're all related, and all the ignorance that's being shown out there, racism, people getting beat up by police. And I'm not saying police are bad people, because police are human beings as well. But we need to start looking at this stuff, man. The way we're eating and this corporate elites, and how there's that, hierarchy, and the people still suffering, the medical system, all that shit we have to look at, because it affects all of us, and we're all one. And so it's hard to not question stuff, and it's hard not to have an awakening and be more life sensitive. I talked about going to Africa in Egypt, which is really, the name is called Kemet, and hearing a lady cry for saying that she's home and realizing she was stolen, and then feeling that trauma in her. I felt it in me, and I felt a healing in me, and I felt it in her. And it's because I'm attuned to the oneness of life, which is what the 12 steps have taught me and helped me have this deeper experience with God consciousness. So to kick somebody out of Alcoholics Anonymous and say that, oh, they're a drug addict, they don't belong here, it's just fucking ignorance. And I'm tired of that shit, and I'm going to stand up to it, even though I'm willing to be a heretic, because a heretic means to think for yourself, to have your own decision and your own choice. And the word orthodox, or to challenge the orthodox thinking, because the word orthodox means to think straight and not question anything, and it's usually by an authority. And pagan, pagan means to have your own belief in God. So we're all pagans. It's not a bad word.
It's not.
But it just hurts me to see the suffering. So I'm challenging stuff. I'm challenging religion. I'm challenging stuff, because that's what all the great ones did, and I feel inspired to do that because I was guided by the great ones.
Beautiful. He's already had some great guests on. I think Gabor Mate's son, Daniel Mate, was on recently. Down the line, I think you might get Gabor on there. I think that would be a huge episode. But I've been watching it. I love it. I love the way that you are with your guests, the questions that you ask, the guests that you pick. I think they're deep people, and I look forward to seeing this thing just grow and grow and grow. It was an honor and a privilege to have you on today. You're one of my best friends, and I don't say that loosely. I have a lot of friends, I have a lot of acquaintances, but I have a lot of people that, when I talk to them, few and far between do I have people that are deep thinkers, that are meaningful, that really are trying to live through their soul and see what this is all about, and see what they can contribute and bring to the world. So thank you. Is there anything you want to say before we phase out? To the universe, or to anybody that might have been listening today?
Yeah, if people are offended with what I say, they should be more offended with the people dying out there from addiction. More offended of the 5% success rate, and we should. And I'm touching on my book really quick, Awakening Within. I'm just trying to get new outlook, because one of the most beautiful lines in the big book is be prepared to look at things from an entirely different angle. And connecting modern science. What if someone doesn't believe in God? How are we going to help them? Because you hear people say that all the time. And remember, their life's on the line. Mm-hmm. And maybe in changing stuff like step 2, and trying to give different angles to look at each step, because people get caught up in the wording, and that might affect their from life or death, right? Mm-hmm. So
it also talks about everyday language.
Yeah, everyday language, which we talked about, but came to believe in a new way of living that can restore you to sanity, because the word sanity really means not that you're crazy, but it means healthy. Mm-hmm. And when you put an IN in front of it, it means not healthy. So when we can look at stuff that, like the trauma and all that stuff inside us, that's creating this unhealthy perception, this unhealthy state of being, maybe we don't have to really force a deity or God on them. Mm-hmm. Let them do, whatever helps them. If it helps them, then so be it. But if it doesn't, let's talk about neuroplasticity. Yeah. So I'm just really challenging, just not to put anyone down. I'm not here to put AA down. I love AA, but I'm here to just try to open people's minds up.
So check his podcast out, Broader Lens Podcast. It's you can find it on YouTube. It's pretty fascinating. He's fascinating. Good old friend. Love you all very much. Until we meet again.
Thank you.
Signing off.